Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about curation and institutional critique. Today on the show, I am joined by the curator, critic, and writer, Alexandra Cunningham Cameron. Alexandra is a curator of contemporary design and the first Hintz Secretarial Scholar at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Most recently, she curated the first retrospective of the pioneering fashion designer Willi Smith, which includes a full exhibition, a book, and an really expansive online archive. Before this, she worked for Design Miami and was the editor-in-chief of the Miami Rail. This is a fun conversation and really covers a lot. We talk about how we define design today, thinking about it both as a type of material culture and a process or approach. We talk about designing exhibitions and using curatorial platforms as a form of institutional critique, using her recent show on Willi Smith as a lens to talk about many of these things. And then we also talk about her own introduction to design coming from the world of literature and the overlap between those two worlds, before ending with what I think is a really nice conversation around research methods and how she looks for her next project and balances that with her current work. I really loved this one, and I think you'll love it too. If you like this show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans that give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you'd like to see it continue, if you want to see more of it in the world, I hope you consider joining us over on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to sign up and help support the show. Thank you for listening, and here is this conversation with Alexandra Cunningham Cameron. This will either be a very easy question to begin with or a very hard question to begin with, Alexandra. At Cooper Hewitt, you are the curator of contemporary design, and I want to know what contemporary design means for you. like either for you kind of personally or for you kind of institutionally in Cooper Hewitt. How do you define contemporary design?
Oh, definitions are so complicated, Jarrett. I think that I have a certain oppositional disorder that makes me not want to define anything. And not to not answer your question, but I felt like being someone who has come to working in a museum through a path that has been very market driven, like through a commercial path, that the constructions and definitions around art and design have been really about trying to create value and define a market. And so when I think about design, I think about basically the expanse of material culture and the built environment. Um, and what I don't think about is actually let me go back a little bit, because I guess I also think about design as a process more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
I think about an aesthetic movement towards function. I think about technique and about intention, which is maybe more important than thinking about a final object.
Right.
So, I mean, what you may have noticed from the work that I've done in my career is that, I haven't specialized
Right.
in a specific way. I've allowed for a conversation about design that I guess is fundamentally based in critical theory, in an idea of trying to undermine power structures or to try to pick something apart, has allowed for a really expansive discussion about art, design, performance, fashion, writing, and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think about process for sure as something that helps to get to an understanding of what design is. But that is a really convoluted response, isn't it?
No. I mean, we think about it the same way, and that's kind of why I asked you the question, because I'm also somebody who bristles at these definitions. And my original first question was just going to be, what is design for you? And I thought, well, let's specify it with this title, contemporary design, because when I think about contemporary design, and when I, like you said, you haven't specialized. When I was looking over the different projects you've worked on, I was like, it is everything contemporary design?
Yeah.
Is so maybe a better, I want to come back to what you're talking about with process too in a bit, but specifically at Cooper Hewitt, do you have a subject matter that you are focusing on there? Do you have a certain curatorial approach? How are you sorting through information to decide what you are going to be working on and thinking on when contemporary design kind of just means everything?
Yeah. Well, I think, and maybe this is a way to like flip the other question or to flip my response. I think you can find design in everything if you're looking
Mm,
for it. And I like the idea of helping people find design in everything and to also think about how they might be designers themselves, and how design is about value structure also, which maybe gets back to the thing that I was trying to say before about critical theory, and kind of a trajectory of like how I've gotten to where I am, at the museum. But I don't there really isn't, other than a basic sort of curatorial scope of work that includes exhibitions, acquisitions, program development, collaborations with the various departments in the museum, publications. There really isn't, um, a defined purview beyond maybe, sort of time bracket for the work that they have to do. And so I think that
right.
I've been invited to explore a really interdisciplinary and complex thinking about design in the museum. And I've only been working at the museum for a couple of years and have just done one exhibition, but
Right.
that's something that I'm really interested in. And also moving beyond, thinking about like curatorial output, right? Like what the people see. I'm really
Hmm.
interested in the process of curating being designed. And I've actually been working really relatedly on this transforming museum experience toolkit with 14 other museum professionals that has really been about design thinking in a way that I had never, been exposed to, because I'm obviously not trained as a designer. And that's
Right.
opened up a whole new world of understanding how intuitively some of the things I'm interested in doing in the museum related to like redesigning museum processes or institutional processes, or the way that
Right.
curators collaborate, or the way that museums, structure their programming or their resources, can really evolve and change.
I, I have so many questions based on based on that. I really like this idea of curating as a type of design process, and that's something I agree with. And I've talked to many kind of designer slash curators about the similarities between the design process and the curatorial process, and it was making me think about what you were talking earlier about kind of the critical theory and questioning power structures and value, and how you think about that in your role as a curator, where you are acquiring objects, where you are putting on exhibitions in an institution that, for better or for worse, has a certain, kind of authority to it. How can you start to, or how do you think about kind of, I don't know, dismantling that power within the museum context itself, how you can use exhibitions to actually do that? How do you kind of actually think through that process in your own work?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. The Smithsonian was established to cultivate an American national identity,
Right, right,
which is such a such a heavy phrase to even respond to start to respond to your question with. But what better place to start to pick these things
right.
apart? Um, uh, I would say that, um, I I try to approach, like a spectrum of curatorial labor, all of the things I described
Mm,
before, right? Exhibitions, publications, advocacy, research, um,
hmm.
as opportunities for for my own transformation, but also social transformation, right?
Mm.
By picking apart these moments of existing power structures that exist like in the world at large, within design systems, but also within institutional structures. Um, and I guess my process has evolved over time, to do this through uh, context and also consensus, right? Collaboration is a big part of it. And as you know, anyone who's had some design training knows, like design is about collaboration, you know? Um, and so I guess the way that I try to orient myself to, from the beginning of a project, try to work towards, to endeavor towards as best as I can, creating a situation where a power structure, speaking very broadly, can be undermined is that I start with multidisciplinary research. I look for feedback. I try to evaluate the project or the topic that I'm interested in within a frame of its contemporary relevance. Like I'm really interested in context. Um, and and I think about the resources that I have at hand, through the institution or, through a personal network or a community of designers, whatever I have that might be able to move something forward and try to create a response that is generous and compatible with the actual project. But all of this like has to rely on collaboration, right? With designers, with stakeholders, with the public. And so these are ideas that have like slowly like evolved in the projects that I've taken on. You know, while I was at Design Miami, and then after, when I was doing some independent curating, and then, into the Smithsonian, and probably at Cooper Hewitt in a much clearer way through various aspects of the Willi Smith exhibition, and more so in projects that I'm beginning to work on now. But it's definitely not something that's perfect, and I think that that's kind of the point of it. I know that it's, right now this conversation around imperfection in cultural institutions is really popular, and I'm fascinated by it. Because traditionally curation has, or scholarly positions have existed within a realm of expertise, and I think that that's something that is eroding, this idea of expertise. Who is the expert? There's so many different types of expertise that should be brought to bear on any type of cultural exercise, on anything. And we have to be open to that. And so trying to create a situation that invites that kind of open exchange is something that it is really important to me.
It's interesting to me that this kind of connects to something that you said very early in the conversation about how you see design as a process. And now we're talking about your curatorial process. And it seems to me that one way to open up those dialogues to kind of challenge ideas of the expert or the authority is to make the research and make those processes public in some way, actually reveal them
Yeah.
inside the institution or in the exhibition. And I think about this with design all the time as kind of like how can we actually better talk about or show the design process, so it's not just design as a noun, but actually that, design as a verb, showing kind of how something got to be the way it is and what are all the values and ideologies that are embedded in that final form. And I wonder if you have thoughts on doing that in a curatorial context. And full disclosure, I'm speaking as someone who has no curating experience at all, kind of an aspiring curator, I guess. But it's very easy to think of an exhibition or to think of the curator as putting together something that is so polished and perfect, and there's like a clear narrative and everything's on the wall just so, all of that. How do you actually kind of reveal that process, reveal your own research or your own kind of learning and evolution through that in an exhibition space or in a book or whatever the different formats that a show might take. Do you know
Right.
what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, there are a few ways to answer the question. I think something that is extremely important to say is that, you know, that institutions do typically, publications typically present information in a way that seems as though it has one source, where you don't really understand, beyond, of course, a list of references, what came from where. And behind that, there's this large group of people and researchers and sources that have contributed to these ideas or these didactics, or this paragraph. And and finding ways to open up, to expose all of the different influences on a project, like a curatorial project, because you know, we sort of have this immediate, um, we have this immediate reference to an exhibition when we talk about curation. And I think that curating is about so much more than exhibition, and that exhibition is really just one thing and is definitely not enough or doesn't even need to happen in some cases, you know? But it's like exhibition with a capital E, the exhibition. Um, and so, I mean, the way that I've tried to open up an awareness around this like large resource of references is through publications, right? Digital and physical publications. So with the Willi Smith Street Couture project at Cooper Hewitt, there's a formal exhibition, but we also published a book that consisted of 50 contributors, half of whom were the ones who really built the research for the exhibition. They told Willi Smith's story to us, in lieu of institutional or published resources, in a way that like really brought his story to life and was essential to the construction of the exhibition. And then, of course, we commissioned new scholarship that was based in a variety of scholarly research. And to sort of take the next step in that, we developed the Willi Smith Digital Community Archive, which was a place that invited additional people who were influenced by Willi Smith or who had perspectives on his career or who had material related to Williware or to digits or to anything connected to telling Willi Smith's story, one of the collaborations with artists, to share that openly on the site. And so we've been collecting all of these stories really, and publishing them alongside the essays that were commissioned for the book and the recollections that were a part of our early research. And so I don't think we realized what an impact that would have on conversations around archiving and institutional narratives. And I think it was more of an intuition. Like it felt like this had to happen in order for us to honor the process of researching and developing the project. It felt essential, and we also felt like there's typically an end point, right? You have a show or you have a book, and there's a deadline associated with it, and then you stop. But really, something that I've learned in my circuitous path to becoming sort of a curator at a museum is that curating never stops. Projects never end. You continue to find out more and more about a topic that you've expressed interest in, or a show that you've done, or an essay that you've written. The relationships that you develop early on you continue to be a part of your life and evolve. And as someone who is trying to create a platform or to share resources or to move forward a conversation in a certain way, like you continue to play that role even if the book is closed, or the show is open. And so this website, in a way, allowed for that conversation to continue and to acknowledge that, especially when you're trying to tell someone's story or you're presenting a designer's work, there isn't an end point. It's something that is continuous, and that it there are different perspectives, that people remember um, events in very different ways. People who experience the same thing remember it very differently. They pick up on different details. They remember something someone said, and the other person remembers something that another person said. Someone has a sense memory, and putting those narratives alongside each other, I think, gets at what we were talking about earlier, which is this sort of deconstructivist idea of how history has been told, and the fact that when you decentralize these narratives, these historical narratives, you get to truths, and that's actually like where the beauty is.
Right, right. I mean, there's so much in there we could talk about. I'm thinking, I always quote, apparently Da Vinci said this. I don't know if he actually did. A painting is never finished, only abandoned, which I've always taken to heart. But lately, I've also been liking. I think our mutual friend Prem Krishnamurthy always says every project is a rehearsal for the next project, which I really like a lot, and I think kind of speaks to this continuing. Everything kind of continues.
I will love that. I will just add one more quote to this bank, which is a Yona Friedman quote. Yona Friedman has been so influential to me, which is that understanding something means misunderstanding it, essentially.
I love that idea. I love that you brought up the Willi Smith show, because in a way, that's been like your big show since you've been at Cooper Hewitt, and in a way, it summarizes so much of what we're talking about already, going all the way back to kind of questions of multidisciplinary. This is a show ostensibly about fashion, but I've heard you say, and when I was looking through all the kind of resources, it's also a show about graphic design. It's a show about film, about photography, about advertising. Like, there's so much in there, but it's also interesting to kind of think about it beyond the exhibition, that it is also a book, that it is this archive, there's this website. And I'm curious how you think about, when you were kind of putting all of this together, how you thought about each of these pieces living independently of each other, but then also how they talk to each other. Like, you can experience one way if you look at the archive, you can experience another way if you look at the book, another way if you look at the exhibition, or you could experience another way if you look at like the book and the exhibition. And I'm curious how you think about how those fit together, and then how they diverge, and how each of those could kind of speak to these questions around kind of deconstructing
Mhm.
the exhibition itself.
Yeah. To be honest, we were thinking about how to create as many access points to Willi Smith's story as possible.
Mm,
And we were really imagining the different audiences that we wanted to reach and how they might come to Willi Smith, and designing around that. So Willi Smith is someone who who whose career and life was about championing diverse lifestyles and redistributing power of the fashion system, right? So in a way, we were thinking about how to emulate Willi Smith's ethos in our curatorial work and in developing the project.
mm,
And so we looked at how to redistribute
hmm.
institutional power,
Right, that's
right?
interesting. Yeah.
Information, to create a platform for voices that like typically aren't integrated into curatorial didactics. We collaborated also with the National Museum of African American History and Culture on oral histories. We leaned into biography and storytelling in a way that felt natural to how we had to tell Willi Smith's story, because the majority of his life and work had not been previously documented. Um, and so it wasn't there wasn't a moment where we had a meeting at the beginning of the project and said, okay, these are all of the ways that we are going to manifest this work and this research, what happened was that as we began to research and to speak to people and to see sort of his life and his influence take shape. I also read a lot of his quotes and a lot of his words. Julie Pastor, who's a curatorialist, is part of the curatorial team on the exhibition, had this brilliant idea in the beginning to pull every single Willi Smith quote we could find out of newspaper articles from the time. And so we had this giant bank of, 600 quotes from Willi Smith. And that's sort of how we were led. And we understood, by reading all of those together, what he was about. My entire office during the planning of the show was just plastered with Willi Smith quotes, and you see in the book sort of how you're led through these different essays and chapters, through the quotes. And so yeah, we sort of responded to what we discovered by trying to develop new interactions, I guess.
I mean, speaking of kind of reaching different audiences, or how each of these, platforms or avenues could reach a different audience, how do you think about audience for a show like this? Like do you have a is there like a person, is there like a type of person that you are thinking about, or how do you actually think about kind of communicating Willi Smith's life and work to, kind of different groups of people?
Well, it really depends. There's definitely not one person that I have in mind or one audience that I have in mind. I mean, the thing that I found to be so exhilarating about Willi Smith's life and work is that he was also evasive about audience.
Mm-hmm.
He understood that he wanted to connect with a really broad, what he called a mainstream audience at a time when the fashion press in particular was trying to pigeonhole him, as a Black designer,
Right.
which to them, had a certain descriptive subtext around it. And
Mm-hmm.
so he really pushed against this idea also that affordable clothing, was not for what was promoted at the fashion industry at the time as, the pinnacle, the elite fashion system. He wanted to break down those boundaries, and he wanted to toy with those systems of power. And so, he refused to play the game and answer questions
Right.
about audience. And I'm not trying to do that now. I I promise. I'm only mentioning it to lead to how I'm going to try to respond to your question, which is that we realized that through his effort to try to reach so many different audiences, right? He pulled in these collaborations with graphic designers, right, to create these, explosive new wave marketing campaigns in a way that no other fashion brand was doing at the time. He was collaborating with performing artists, to try to
Mm-hmm.
bring this idea of movement and expression to the stage so that people could see actually, the potential for these kind of like free flowing, transitional garments, like in action.
Mm-hmm.
He was collaborating, with avant-garde multimedia artists, and techno utopians, to question the role of technology. He was interested in television. He made films in order to share the work, and his collaborator Laurie Mallet was a big part of that. So he was looking at so many different strategies. The artist T-shirts where he was putting artwork on people's bodies on the streets with Jenny Holt,
Right.
Rauschenberg, Gilbert and George. So, we kind of did the same thing. And I
Right.
really, I like this idea of, of thinking about, curation being led by, subject matter sounds very impersonal, but by the subject, you
I mean, the yeah, that's so interesting, and the reason I asked the question is I recently talked to Dayan Sujic for the podcast,
know.
former director of the Design Museum,
Mhm.
and we were talking about how kind of like how we're talking about right now, how design has become much more multidisciplinary. The borders of design are much more fluid than they used to be. And he said something that I've thought about a lot since, is that yes, that is true, but there's still these kind of like silos, like he's still within design. And he would say at the Design Museum, if we put on a fashion exhibition, the graphic designers largely didn't care. They walked right by. Like graphic designers wanted to see graphic design shows, fashion designers wanted to see fashion design shows. I don't know if that's totally true, but I do sense some of that in my own experience with trying to blur these lines with this podcast and talk to people who otherwise wouldn't be in the same circles, and going from like, you know, a designer to an academic to a curator and trying to get them in dialogue. And I see these different types of design where they're just kind of all talking to each other. And I'm so interested in how we break through those silos and start to get these different types of designers talking to each other. And I was kind of curious how you thought about that with somebody like Willi Smith
Yeah.
at an institution like Cooper Hewitt that can't just, you know, uh, cater to a specific type of designer, a specific type of audience, how you start to think about breaking down some of those walls.
Well, as you know, despite how things are represented, in museums or in corporate structures in the industry, in real life, there is sort of this natural multidisciplinary urge.
Right.
And there are creative communities where artists talk to designers, talk to people who have nothing to do with the arts, and everything feeds into each other.
Right.
And I think that with Willi Smith, we really wanted to take advantage of the idea that he was a conduit for this type of creative community. And by representing that, we could have chosen to do a retrospective that was focused, on formal innovations and the fashions and the different collections. We didn't have a tremendous amount of garments, but it would have been possible to do a show like that. But we
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be able to create a space where people from all of these different disciplines, someone who might only care about fashion could come in and learn something about graphic design, someone who can
Right.
only
Right.
architecture, and want to understand what Sight was doing, with Willie Ware in the
Yeah.
early 80s might come in and learn about Les Levine, and not art. And those sorts of accidental encounters seem to be a responsibility of the institution to create. It's not something that always needs to be pedagogical,
Right.
or
Right.
didactic. There's a way to create these sorts of happy accidents, and through that, inspire people. I have this idea that is maybe controversial.
Uh-oh.
And honestly, I mean, not so controversial. I'm leading up to something that is like not so controversial. But one of the reasons that I was especially excited to work at Cooper Hewitt in particular is because Cooper Hewitt champions bringing in graphic designers and architects to create completely new environments for
Mm.
the exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of have this idea, and maybe it's because, I grew up in Miami, but that there's really an opportunity to to create a vibe, right? To like move someone in an exhibition. That feeling, it's like that feeling when and we haven't done this for a very long time. I mean, some of us some of us much longer than others, but where you step into a nightclub, you know, and you like
Yeah.
that wall of heat hits you and like the bass reverberates in your body and there's this totally intoxicating
Yeah.
sensation of possibility, and discovery. I feel like it's possible to recreate that in the gallery of a museum.
I love that. Yes. Yes. Let's do that.
So atmosphere, I think, is something that is really important. And Willi Smith certainly was creating an atmosphere. I mean, that was very much
Right.
what, the design commissions were all about, and the collaborations with Namjoon Paik and
Mm-hmm.
Juan Downey. I mean, he and Laurie truly understood like the power, of an atmosphere to move people to appreciate something that they might not have otherwise valued. And Willi Smith, when he first started designing, he was looked at as an extremely talented junior sportswear designer, and by the end of it, he was collaborating really with some of the most important artists and designers of the 20th century in order to like completely change people's values around affordability, around gender binaries, around racial diversity. And it's an extremely extremely powerful story. And so like Willi Smith, like in the spirit of Willi Smith, we also wanted to bring many different people together, to have a similar sort of experience that they might have in a Willi Wear fashion show. I mean, we we are not blasting music in the galleries, but with our
You could.
we have a lot of video. We have a lot of. I mean, he was also commissioning music from Jorge Socaras, who is a post-punk composer, and we have all of the soundtracks. And so we've been very tempted, but we have a lot of archival video in the show, and so there's some sound leak with our directional sound, so we weren't able to play the full soundtrack.
Speaking of Miami, we've talked about your kind of circuitous path to museums. Let's talk a little bit about your background, and because I'm interested in how you got into design, because you originally studied literature, right?
Yes. I studied literature in my undergrad, and I got a master's in English from Florida International University, and my focus there was on diasporic literature
Okay.
and deconstructivist theory, and trying to marry those two things. So literature primarily of Jewish and African diaspora.
Oh, interesting. And then where did the design side come in? Where did your interest in design come in?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was mentioning about critical theory before.
Yeah.
I really I had this sense that I was having this conversation with a very, very small group of people in academia. And I was really interested in trying to understand how some of these deconstructivist ideas also manifest in the real world.
Mhm.
Um, and I had always been a lover of design, not in any sort of formal way, but when I started to think back about how I was raised, I was constantly redesigning my room. I go to these
Mhm.
garage sales and estate sales with my family where I was just like immersed, in decades and decades of stuff that ended up in South Florida, from all of the different people who've come through the state for various reasons. Um, and I was like moved by crazy like early encounters with architecture, like the
Mhm.
Architectonica Pink House.
Oh yeah.
I lived across from this development called Quayside, where Don Johnson lived, and you would see him drive like his pearl colored like Lamborghini or something. So it was like Coke
Yeah.
Cowboys, like pool in the living room, sort of, Miami upbringing. And so I was like, I've never studied this. I'm not even quite sure if it's possible to study it, but maybe I
Mm.
should try to pursue this career. And actually, at the time, I was writing my master's thesis and working in workforce development with adults with disabilities who are in vocational school.
Mm.
And it seemed like I could go in two directions. I could go into a primarily a service direction, or I could explore some sort of career in the arts, specifically in design. And it was right at the time that Design Miami was founded in Miami, which is a company that was run by a group of young women, and so I just became determined to try out Design Miami, before I got too old, and disappeared some like small liberal arts college in the middle of the country, never to be heard from again.
Right. Right.
um, and yeah, and so I, you know, I wasn't hired. I like went through this crazy process of interviewing, that involved like small office rooms with lots of cigarettes, and I was really seduced by the whole thing. Where I was like, what is going on here? um, what is this design world? And, you know, at the time also, Design Miami sort of became known for connecting specifically the Western European design galleries with the United States. There are probably serious design collectors who are, constantly traveling overseas and sort of understanding um, the sort of archaeological work that a lot of these people were doing. But, they were really finding and bringing incredible design works, to the market, many of which have been acquired by museums. And that was kind of my introduction to this design ecosystem, that
Mm.
involves so many different moving parts. Um, but yeah, so I grew up at the fair. That's how I like to think about it.
I've lost track of how many people I've had on this show who are in design but come from a background in literature of some form. Do you have a sense of, did that background have some sort of influence on how you think about design or the work that you've done since, or is there something from that educational experience that translates into this world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like literature and design are both related to storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I like to think that experience exists in language, and language
Mm.
gives form to experience.
Yeah.
And experience is also very much influenced by the physical world around us, and those things are so totally intertwined. And for me, my process as a curator, which is really become, as a curator who's like very much focused on exhibitions, right, and publications,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of output, it is the responsibility of a storyteller, and
Right.
I
Yeah.
didn't study creative writing. I mean, I was very close with the creative writing department when I was at Florida International University. They have an incredible creative writing program, and I was sort of like situated within that young group of writers. Actually, one of them, who became one of my closest friends, just came out with a book called Infinite Country, and I was listening to. She's like on her book tour now, her virtual book
Mm.
tour now,
Mm-hmm.
and I was listening to her talk about her new novel, and how she was trying to create this. It's like a very slim novel. It's called Infinite Country. She's trying to create this like sense of intimacy and urgency, as though she was like writing it from one breath, as though it's almost
Mm.
like a daydream. And I was like, oh, this is almost, like my thinking about how exhibitions need to sort of manifest for people, where you encounter this type of atmosphere through the story that's beyond the
Right.
actual language, the didactics, or the objects that you see. But I think there's so many parallels. I mean, I read novels as part of my research process,
Yeah.
that's big for me, because I kind of want to understand, you know, what might be most meaningful for people.
Yeah.
I'm only one person. I want to tap into um, what might move people, what risks we might be able to take, and
Yeah.
and novels and theory and philosophy and lots of newspaper articles all sort of coalesce into a vibe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know exactly what you mean, and it's a perfect setup. I have like two and a half more questions to wrap up, and this perfectly sets up my next question, which I'll admit to you is a very selfish question. It's something that I'm just trying to figure out in my own life and work right now, and I feel like you might be able to help me. Um, I'm very curious about your research process and your media diet. Basically, you have to both probably have kind of deep scholarship on a specific subject, on things you're working on. I mean, the amount of reading that you did for Willi Smith, I can't imagine. But then you also seem like you have to kind of be always looking out for stuff that's outside of your focus at the time, to kind of know what everything else is going on and what the next project might be, and kind of, who's doing interesting stuff, or, new books or something. How do you kind of sort through all of that? How do you kind of balance between the focused research and the unfocused research?
Hmm. I think they inform each other.
Mm.
I sit at my desk with a stack of books and a full toolbar of open tabs.
Okay.
And
This sounds like me already. Okay.
and I go back and forth between the two, to be honest, because as a curator, I'm most interested in pursuing projects that have contemporary relevancy. And
Hmm.
I think that's an important distinction to make, because there are incredible researchers who, are focused on one specific type of research and are going down this path and are continuing to build on this research. Um, you know, and and I'm the person who takes this research and marries it with a variety of other influences to try to
Right.
contextualize it for a much broader audience, for various audiences. And I think those audiences do change depending on the project. It's not necessary to just like think about one audience all the time, and that is like your audience. I think that we
Hmm.
have we have the opportunity, and the responsibility to think of many audiences and to speak to different types of people depending on the concern of the project. So
Right.
I think they naturally inform each other. It's very difficult for me to think of something outside of like out of context.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the reason I ask it is, like, I feel like I'm always kind of struggling between, for example, researching you for this show, and, like, reading everything that you had written and watching your interviews, but then also wanting to figure out who the next guest is going to be, and trying to, always kind of scouring who other people are, plus any kind of like writing and teaching that I'm doing that I have to perform. Like, oh, there's like, how do I kind of balance those things that I have to like focus on, that I need to know a good amount about to communicate out, versus just that kind of scouring, that kind of like gazing out to see who else is doing interesting stuff. You know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean, and I think it can be overwhelming, especially when you go on a deep digital dive. I mean, I also look at social media. I've been so fascinated by the Dank Lloyd Wright meme page. I think it's the closest that any of us have gotten to seeing into the mind of an architect before. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really fantastic. And what I would say is that you essentially have to go with your gut. Like you expose yourself to all of this research. You try, you try to understand, you know, the streams that would be the most meaningful for people, um, and then you go with your gut and decide how to move forward with the thesis. Right.
Right.
And maybe you have to change that, and maybe you're undermined. I think this idea also that curators or institutions are providing answers is a problem.
Mm,
you know
mm, mm-hmm,
Curating
mm-hmm.
is about detonating ideas. It's about a provocation. We're not providing solutions or answers. We're providing like a critical frame for people to think about life and themselves, designers and artists.
I love that. It also kind of brings this conversation full circle. This is exactly kind of where we started. So it's a perfect kind of setup for my last question, which also relates to the previous question. I'm curious what you're reading right now. What can you tell me some of those stacks of books on your desk right now?
All right, so right now I'm reading We Too, Essays on Sex Work and Survival.
Mm.
I'm reading Hervé Guibert, To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life. I'm rereading Jamaica Kincaid, At the Bottom of the River. I'm reading Edith Wharton. I'm reading uh, John Fassman's book on surveillance. I'm reading
Oh
John
yeah.
Boland's new book, the only design book here.
No, I love
Matter
that. I love
for
that.
design?
I love that about that stock. No, I prefer the non-design books, to be honest.
I have the new Enzo Mari book here. I wrote a
Oh
short
yeah.
essay for that one, and it just arrived from the Triennale, so I've been going through that. Let's see. I have a Kay Dick book over here, and some Derrida. And
Mm,
some Derrida, Archive Fever. I'm writing an essay actually. Jarrett Ernest is
nice.
editing an issue of a magazine that's focused on archives, and so I'm writing an essay about archiving and Willi Smith and that experience.
Oh,
So
nice.
I'm getting into the psychoanalytic side of archiving.
I love that. That is a stack. That is a
There are a
great
few
stack
more,
of
but
books.
I'm kind of like I don't want to. I can't give away all my secrets, Jarrett.
No, that is way more than anyone has ever given me at the end of the show before. So I love that answer. That was the best answer to that question that anyone's ever given on the show before. This was such a fun conversation for me. I really enjoyed this and really like kind of hearing how you think about your work. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like I'm already looking forward to our next conversation, hopefully in person.
This episode was recorded on March 26th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.